In general, people didn't marry for love until really the last 150 years. Why not? Well, because the economic stuff mattered so much. When we think about marriage today, we think about the things we have in common with them in terms of our interests and our likes, the things we like to consume, right? Do they like to travel? Do they like to go out to eat? Are they skiers? What books do they read? Those are the things we think about. They're about consumption and about how a couple might be complementary in terms of their interest in consumption. But for most of human history, it was production that mattered.
Thank you for all coming this evening and for your Friday night. I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the lecture. I'd like to thank the Center for Business and Public Policy and the Academy on Capitalism and Limited Government Foundation for co-sponsoring this event and making things like this possible. We've been holding speakers for over 3-4 years now, and we have another excellent speaker for you tonight. Stephen Horwitz will be talking about capitalism and the family. Steve Horwitz is currently the Charles A. Dana Professor of Economics at St. Louis University in Canton, New York, and an affiliated senior scholar at the Mercatus Center in Arlington, Virginia. He is the author of 3 books: Monetary Evolution, Free Banking and Economic Order, Micro Foundations and Macroeconomics, An Austrian Perspective, and Hayek's Modern Family, Classical Liberalism, and the Evolution of Social Institutions. He has written extensively on Austrian economics, Hayekian political economy, monetary theory and history, and American economic history. His work has been published in professional journals such as History of Political Economy, Southern Economic Journal, and the Cambridge Journal of Economics. He has also done public policy research for the Mercatus Center, Heartland Institute, and the Cato Institute, and has been a guest on several radio and cable TV shows. Horwitz is also a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute in Canada and a distinguished scholar at the Foundation for Economic Education. A member of the Mont Pelerin Society, he has a PhD in economics from George Mason University and an AB in economics and philosophy from the University of Michigan. This academic year, Horwitz is a visiting scholar at the John H. Schnatter Institute for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, where in the fall he will become the Schnatter Distinguished Professor of Free Enterprise in the Department of Economics in the Miller College of Business. So please join me in welcoming Steve Horwitz to talk about capitalism in the family.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you guys all for coming out tonight, especially to see a Michigan grad talk. I won't say anything more about that. All right, well, my topic tonight is capitalism in the family, and you can see my rather extensive subtitle, which is about the ways in which capitalism created more loving families, liberated women, and made same-sex marriage possible. So let me say 1 or 2 quick things off the top. I'm going to make an argument tonight that capitalism was really important for doing all of these things, and you should not, I'm going to make a strong argument about the role of capitalism played. But let me be clear from the start, there were certainly other factors that mattered here historically, and if one wanted to do a whole history of the evolution of the family, you'd have to talk about more things. But I really want to focus on the economic factors, on the way in which capitalism mattered for this story. So if I sound like I'm kind of overstating the case, it's intentional to some degree. So what I want to do is make an argument, and let me sort of show you what I want to do, and then kind of work my way through it. First thing I want to talk about is that prior to capitalism, and so prior to, say, around the early 19th century, the family was not a nice place, and especially not a nice place for women and children. If you were male, and certainly if you were white and male, the family was all right. But if you were anything but that, the family was not particularly a nice place. And what we know and love as the modern family, and I'll take some time in a couple minutes to define what we mean by the modern family. What we know and love as the modern family is to a significant degree a product of the advent of capitalism. That is, the forces that came around when the economic system began to change in important ways in the 19th century, those changes caused changes in the families in ways that were good, that we now think of as being the positive parts of family that we know and love. And one other quick note I want to say here too is that one of these things I'm going to somewhat take for granted in this talk is that a good deal of the wealth that we have seen accumulate over the last say, 200 years, the way in which both that average people in the West have become much, much wealthier, and poor people in the West as well, that's significantly due to market capitalism and competitive capitalism. I'm going to take that kind of for granted, and if we get to the Q&A at the end and you want to ask about that, I'm certainly happy to talk about it. So if it's true that capitalism was an important force in creating what we know and love as the modern family, third point I want to make is that this argument makes both progressives and conservatives uncomfortable. Let me start with the conservatives. It makes conservatives uncomfortable because many conservatives, most conservatives, at least pay some lip service to free enterprise and capitalism and how it's good. I'm not convinced they always really mean it. We've seen that in the recent presidential election. But at least they pay lip service to it. But at the same time, they tend to be very skeptical about the changes in the family that have taken place, say, over the last 50 years. And for them, the idea that capitalism is part of the story that led to these things, especially the point about same-sex marriage, is going to make them uncomfortable. But I think it also makes progressives uncomfortable. For progressives who largely celebrate the changes we've seen in the family and the sort of liberation of women and same-sex marriage, I think they're right to celebrate those things. The fact that it might be capitalism that's significantly responsible for those changes is going to make them a little uncomfortable. And one of the things I enjoy about this talk and about this topic and about the things that are in my last book is my view is if I'm making progressives and conservatives uncomfortable, I'm probably on to something good, okay? So part of you might think about tonight is how that dynamic plays out. But I want to add, there's one group, though, that this doesn't make uncomfortable, and that's what we might call classical liberals, or what today we would call libertarians, right? For whom this connection between economic and social freedom is something that they've long understood. That when we give people economic freedom, we shouldn't be surprised that they begin to branch out and take advantage of the social freedom that often comes along with it. And that those two things work together and that they're not at odds with each other. And so one of the things you might think about as I go through this talk tonight is what's that relationship between giving people the freedom to use their property as they wish, to invest as they wish, and to engage in free enterprise as they wish. What's the relationship between that and the freedom to form the kinds of families that we wish to form? So let me make two quick points about the family that I think are important for understanding what I want to do tonight. One, there's no such thing as the traditional family. People talk about the traditional family. But the fact is all social institutions evolve and change. The family we think of as traditional, say if you think of mom, dad, and 2.1 kids or whatever it might be, right? And particularly if you want to go for that kind of 1950s family with dad working and mom at home and all that sort of thing, that's not traditional. That was a unique product of social forces, economic forces after World War II. The organization of the family has wildly changed over the course of human history, right? That traditional family is not a universal family structure. And one thing to think about, if you think about those 1950s TV families like on Leave It to Beaver and these other shows, right? The actresses who were playing these stay-at-home moms were themselves working mothers. Right? Who was taking care of their kids? Well, they were busy being actresses on television shows. So even that undermines the notion that somehow everybody had this kind of family. The other point I want to make about family, it's important to distinguish the functions that families perform from the forms or the structure that families take. What families look like, their form, is a distinct issue from what families do, their functions. So we can talk about what do families look like. What are the genders of the people married? How many kids do they have? Do they have kids at all? Are they rich? Are they poor? Are they black? Are they white? We can talk about what families look like, their structure or their form. But we can also talk about their functions. What do families do? Why do we have families? Families provide economic resources. They provide models of love and affection. They raise children. There's all kinds of things we can talk about there. This difference between function and form leads to all this confusion and ambiguity when we talk about the phrase a normal family. Right? If I say, do you have a normal family, or what does a normal family look like, right? It's not clear exactly what that means. Do we mean normal like statistically normal, like the most frequent kind of family, the most common kind of family? Because that seems to be talking about structure or form. Or do we mean normal in the sense of healthy or functional? Right? We talk about dysfunctional families. They're not normal in some sense because they're not good at doing what it is that families do. And so when we talk about normal families, we often confuse these, and this is why people frequently disagree about what we mean by that. So keep those in mind as we talk tonight too. So let me say, I'm going to work sort of backwards here. I want to start by talking about the modern family. Then I'm going to go back and talk about the pre-modern family and then explain how capitalism got us from one to the other. So what do we mean by the modern family? There's a possible modern family. When we think of the modern family, we think of usually four things. First of all, marriage by choice and by love. We get married to the people we choose, and we choose them because we love them. It's important to understand this is particularly modern. It's also important to understand that choice and love are different things. You can choose who you marry, but not marry them for love, right? So we run those together, but they're important to keep them distinct. Another part of the modern family is that the modern family is nuclear, it's private, and it's insulated. We think of the family as kind of being this separate space that's different from, say, the market or from politics or other kinds of social institutions. And by nuclear, of course, we mean mom, dad, baby, and the kids. That's it. We don't see as many families today with extended family members or boarders living in their household or things like this. A third part of the modern family is that children are sentimentalized and childhood is sheltered. The idea that kids are unique, special things, right? People with baby on board things on their car. We think about all the ways in which parents today, maybe yours, are overprotective of their children and are concerned about any dangers that their children might face. We can also think about the way in which we keep you all in school for 22 years. You guys haven't produced a thing in your lives, really, right? We keep you in school for 22 years. Why? Because we think of childhood as being this separate, special time, right? That's sheltered, that's away from the concerns of the adult world. Call it a bubble if you want, but the phrase that many people use is the sheltered childhood. This is peculiarly modern as well. And finally, equality of the sexes, and in particular, the idea that women have significant financial independence, and the result of which is more divorce. The higher divorce rate, the financial independence of women, and the general equality of sexes, particularly in the context of marriage, is also particularly modern. As we'll see in a minute, the pre-modern family didn't have these things. So that's what we mean by the modern family. So what did families look like before, and how did capitalism cause this transition? Well, the first thing we have to understand is that for most of human history, the family was the primary and sort of fundamental economic institution. What families were about economic activity, and in particular, the household was the unit of production. The way we think about a firm today, right, or a corporation or a business, that's what the household, that's what families did. The easiest way to see this, of course, is to think about agriculture, but it doesn't have to be just agriculture. In all the kinds of businesses people engaged in for most of human history, it was the family and the family members who contributed to production. Again, whether it was farming or small crafts or whatever it might be. The family and the business, the family and economic production were linked. And we have something that's still with us today that's evidence of that link between family and work, right? Anyone want to guess what I'm talking about? I don't know anyone in the room, so I can't. I'm sure there's examples of this in the room. There's a hint for you. How do we know that people's families used to be about work?
It's family businesses.
Not just family businesses. What about last names? All right? Baker, butcher. Anyone know what Coopers do? They make barrels. Fletcher make arrows. All the Smiths, right? All of these things are work. All of these things are work that people used to do. And for most of human history, your family name represented the work you did. If your name was John Smith, you were John the Smith. So last names are an important part of this story too. They tell us this link between the family and work. The other thing to remember about most of human history, and certainly human history before the advent of capitalism, is that most people were desperately poor. Most people lived at the margins of survival. And so economic decisions about who you married, for example, were important to the community. If you married the wrong person and you weren't able to grow the crops or produce whatever it is you were producing, that had an impact on the community. When you're living on the brink of poverty and starvation all the time, right, those things matter. And that's important to understand for the family. In addition to being an economic institution, though, the family was also a political institution. For rich folks, families and marriages were about political power. Marrying another wealthy person, you can think of a whole bunch, say, of Shakespeare plays here, right, that involve marriage and political power, right? For poor folks, families and marriage were about networks of community and social cooperation, right? And also of protection. You got married so that you would have, if you get married, you expand the number of people who are sort of in your network who care about you. One of the most powerful things about getting married is having children, because now two different families have the same grandchildren that they care about. And historically, for poor folks, getting married was a way to expand these networks of cooperation. In addition to those, we can also talk about the way in which the pre-modern family, the pre-modern family contrasts with the modern family. So in the pre-modern family, marriage was arranged, but even where marriage was chosen, right, it wasn't about love. And this is important, right? Even where people could choose their spouses, in general, people didn't marry for love until really the last 150 years. Why not? Well, because the economic stuff mattered so much. When we think about marriage today, right, we think about being romantically in love with someone and possibly marrying them. What do we think about? We think about the things we have in common with them in terms of our interests and our likes, the things we like to consume, right? Do they like to travel? Do they like to go out to eat? Are they skiers? What books do they read? Those are the things we think about. They're about consumption and about how a couple might be complementary in terms of their interest in consumption. But for most of human history, it was production that mattered, right? You married someone because you could work together. Right now, we might, sort of heterosexual man might look at a woman and think she's beautiful or smart or whatever. For most of human history, it's about, can this woman bear children and can she help me on the farm, right? Ooh, nice shoulders, right? And good birthing hips. Those were the key, right? Because those are what mattered, right? That's what mattered for marriage, and that's what mattered for family. It's also important to remember, of course, at this time, that women were almost property, even in the Western world. If you've never heard of coverture laws, here's your chance to hear about them. Coverture laws basically said that a married woman, when a couple got married, the woman was covered by the man. And what that meant was the man could make all of the economic decisions for the entire household. In fact, married women until the late 19th century could not own property, could not engage in economic contracts. They essentially didn't exist as economic entities. Right? The argument was that because you were married, you were covered by your husband, and your husband therefore decided he was the head of the household, and he decided everything for you. These laws began to break down in the late 19th century, a little bit earlier in Great Britain, but then in the United States, sort of state by state. And Illinois, by the way, was one of the first states to, there was a famous lawsuit in Illinois, one of the first states to sort of change these laws so that women could own property and married women could own property and engage in contracts and so forth. So again, for much of that history, women were effectively property, or at least certainly the property of their husbands. And by the way, this idea kind of lingered all the way on into the 20th century in laws that said you couldn't rape your wife, right? Because the same logic held, right? If you were married, she therefore consented to everything, right? So how could you couldn't rape her because she was part of you in some sense. And it wasn't until well into the 20th century in a few states that those laws were taken off the book, but they come from the same basic idea. What about kids? The best way to understand kids historically was that they were economic assets, right? That if you think about what children did or how people thought about them, right? You can think about them in two ways. Kids were workers. If you had a farm, the more kids you had, the more workers you had. And the more kids you had, the more support you would have for your old age. Remember, there's no Social Security, there's no retirement income. In fact, there's not even any retirement. In the 1880s, the average age of retirement for an American man was death, right? You didn't retire, okay? You relied on your kids to support you in your old age if you couldn't work anymore. So the more kids you had. Plus, remember something else, right? Making your own children is much cheaper than hiring them. It's also a lot more fun, okay? So for most of human history, the way that people got workers was to make them themselves. Of course, who was this a problem for? This was a problem for women, right? Because women historically spent much of their fertile years either pregnant or nursing or both. And one of the most dangerous things a woman could do in human history was to give birth, right? We know children died in childbirth, but women frequently died in childbirth as well. And one of the things we know is that there are historically, families would often have two children or more with the same first name. Why is that? Well, one reason is that that the odds of a child making it to age 18 at birth were about 50-50. And so many families name 2 or 3 of their kids with the same first name to ensure that one made it to adulthood alive. That's a very different world than the one that we live in. As a result, much less sentimentality about children. It's not that parents didn't love their children back then. They did, but it was often harder to express that. It was harder to make that meaningful in ways when you had more children, of course, but certainly when your children half of them were likely to die before the age of 18, right? Well, you can read all these stories about parents who had, and I'm going to show you a slide in a minute, right? Parents who had sort of had multiple children die and multiple funerals for their children. This is a very different world than the world that we live in. Last point to make about this is that families were public institutions, right? I mentioned before that the modern family is private and nuclear and all these kinds of things. Historically, though, the church, the state, and the community were very much involved in the decisions about who to marry and how many kids to have and so on, for all the reasons I was talking about before, right? Those economic decisions mattered and the community cared. Things like divorce were largely illegal. Adoption was illegal for a long time too in some places, right? So all kinds of ways in which family behavior, you can think about the Scarlet Letter here, all kinds of ways that family behavior was regulated by political forces and by the community as well. One thing though that hasn't changed, and I've been sounding about how terrible it is, the family was and remains today indispensable as a transmitter of cultural norms and values. And I'm going to start to talk in a little bit about all the different ways that the family has sort of the different forms that families take today. And don't misunderstand me. This is not an argument that families are bad or unnecessary. I think families are hugely important as social institutions. And this is a key reason why, right? So just don't misunderstand me here. I want to show this one slide. It'll be maybe hard to see in the back. Maybe not. That is from a friend of mine was in New Orleans at a cemetery and found this tombstone from one family. That is 8 children from one family. I don't know if you can see the dates that they died, but 11 years old, 7 years old, 15 months, right? We can't even imagine what this would mean to have 8 of your children die. Now this is, again, fairly extreme, but this is the world of the pre-modern family. Okay, so now you're thinking, all right, not good, right? What did capitalism do? Right? How did capitalism change this? How did capitalism help us transition to what we now call the modern family? Well, the first thing capitalism did is it gave us wage labor. And what do we mean by that, right? For most of human history, most people worked for themselves, right? You think about the family as the site of production, the way we were just talking about. But what capitalism did was create the opportunity for people to work for other people who were not their family. Now, the factory is the most obvious example of this, but other things too, right? If you think about what a factory is, factories are hiring non-family members to work, right? And what this did was separate home and work for more people than ever before, for a lot of people for the first time in human history. The idea of going out to work, that you worked someplace other than in your own home, right, and with your own family members, this is a key change that happens as a result of the advent of capitalism. The other key part, as I hinted at earlier, is that wages and wealth rise, right? As the factory system and as market exchange and trade happens, people get wealthier, workers have better machinery to work with, they're more productive, they get paid higher wages. Over time, this has a number of really important implications. The first of which is family size shrinks. People don't need to have as many kids before because they don't need those kids to work on a farm. They're also making better incomes. The adults are making better incomes themselves. They don't need as many kids. And so parents begin to have fewer children. And this has some really important implications to think about. It's one of the most universally recognized empirical demographic facts. As economic growth takes place, family size shrinks. It's happened all over the world. And these are the reasons why. And it suggests that when people make decisions about how many kids to have, they're thinking, as it were, like economists, right? They're actually comparing costs and benefits and saying, is it worth it? You know, we hear these stories all the time of when sort of Western groups go into other parts of the world where they think families are too large and they leave them birth control, they leave them condoms or something like that. And they come back a month later and find all the condoms have been turned into water balloons. Right? And they go, what's the problem? Don't people know how to use condoms? They know how to use them. They don't want to. They need more kids, right? If you're poor, kids are an asset. As you get wealthier, they become a cost. You guys are a huge cost. You don't produce anything. We spend thousands educating you and feeding you. Right? I have a college-age daughter, so trust me, right? You're a huge cost. but it's worth it, right? We're investing in you and all those kinds of things. And this is part of what capitalism did. It changed people from having lots of kids to having fewer kids and investing more in them. It's a shift from quantity to quality, all right? So congratulate yourselves on being the quality survivors. The other thing that happens here is that early on, of course, in the Industrial Revolution and the early years of capitalism, women and kids worked in the factories. It's important to understand, of course, that before the factories, they worked on the farm and worked longer and in worse conditions than they did in the factories. But as wages rise and wealth rises, kids' incomes aren't needed, and eventually women's incomes aren't needed. And throughout the late 19th century, they begin to return to the household. And this is where we get this kind of Victorian domestic bliss idea with mom at home with the kids and dad out to work. Marriage begins to transform to become about love. The economic stakes of marriage are smaller now. It doesn't matter. You don't need those great shoulders to work on the farm, right? You can now afford to marry for love. And historically, love is what you had with your mistress, right? Not who you married, but with your mistress. And now, by the end of the 19th century, middle-class families in the Western world anyway, are marrying for love. And they're marrying for love because the economics doesn't matter. In essence, what capitalism did was to take economic production out of the home, bring it out to the market, and open that space in the home for all these other kinds of things. Okay? And of course, childhood changes too, right? As I've suggested, we begin to invest in you, we begin to shelter you. Even the notion of childhood as a thing and adolescence as a thing is a peculiarly modern phenomenon, right? Historically, kids would all be sent out to work or apprentice out often at age 10 or 11, right? And you guys don't have to do that again, hopefully, until you're out of college. Okay? The other thing that happens in this period too is that the family becomes more private. The state, the church, and the community are all restrained. And this is a product not so much of capitalism, though it mattered, but also democracy and the liberal revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th century matter a lot here too. As individualism, as privacy, as these kinds of things, private property become more important, the family begins to be recognized as part of that sphere of the private. One of the most important things capitalism did that has an impact on the family, of course, is it transformed the lives of women. The single most important demographic fact of the 20th century was the increase in female labor force participation in the United States and in Western Europe, in what we used to call the First World. Okay? And so here we have shot from the 1940s of a bunch of women working in an accounting office. They're all working with hand calculators. What's interesting about this, of course, is that these jobs basically don't exist anymore, right? They've all been replaced by, this or computers or the like. Okay, but for women, right, this was part of their working lives in the early and mid 20th century. So this growth in female labor force participation was crucial. So why did it happen? Why were suddenly women being pulled into the labor force? And remember, if they're being pulled into the labor force, that's going to have implications for marriage and family and children and all these other kinds of things. The answer, by the way, is not because men got paid less and you couldn't survive on one income, right? The answer, it turns out, is a combination of two different things. First of all, the economy continued to grow, right? The forces of the market and capitalism were creating economic growth. That increases the demand for labor. We needed more workers, and especially as we began to move towards a service-oriented economy and services became a bigger part of the economy, this worked to women's advantages, and women got hired in all kinds of clerical and service jobs, right? If you've seen Mad Men, you have a sense of what life was like in the middle of the 20th century for female workers, and I want to come back to that point in the Mad Men example in just a minute. In addition to the demand for women to become workers, women were getting increasingly better educated. What economists call their human capital was increasing. They had more education, they had more skills, they were more productive workers. So those two things together made the wages that women could command even higher. You can think about this, all the econ majors can think about in terms of demand and supply. The demand for that labor is going up, right? Women are more productive, they can command a higher wage up their supply curve, right? We see more women working, we see higher wages for women, we see women being willing to go out of the house and into the labor force. The other piece of this puzzle, of course, is the fall in time needed at home thanks to household technology, okay? Right? The microwave is a huge example of this today, but if you go back earlier in the 20th century, here's a claim I'm going to make, and you think about whether you think this is true. The washing machine did more for the liberation of women than did getting the vote. If you know what it was like to wash clothes before a washing machine, you might have some appreciation for that. It was a job that took multiple people, often multiple days, to wash clothing by hands. It has historically been women's work to do that, and women's work, say, to drag water from a nearby stream. Women's work to heat it up. Women's work to work with nasty soap, right, to try to get this stuff clean. Women's work to run it through the wringer, all right? The washing machine changed all of that, along with other inventions too. The vacuum cleaner, the carpet sweeper, right? All kinds of, even the freezer, right, as opposed to the old-fashioned icebox. All of these things made it less necessary for women to be in the house and made it easier when they were. By the way, fewer kids too. The fewer kids you have, the less time women need to be in the home as well. And these things together, this contributed to women's willingness to work. And again, this was a product of the wealth and technology that capitalism brought with us. But there's a third thing too. As people get wealthier, they can afford to buy market alternatives to things that are made in the household. And my favorite example of this, if I've got some older folks sitting down front. I'm going to poll them. When you were kids, how many times did you go out to eat or bring food in to eat? And you're shaking your head like zero, right? I mean, Bill, how many times when you were a kid? You're about my age. Once a week. My indication is that's even more frequent than the typical for our generation. I think my house maybe twice a month. All right, students, how many times when you were growing up, and let's say when you were in high school, did you either go out to eat with your family or bring food in that you bought out? 4 or 5 times a week, maybe? Yeah, every day. Lots, right? I don't ever remember my mom going out to the nail salon to get her nails done, right? She did it herself. I don't remember, we didn't pay someone to mow my lawn when I was a kid. My dad had a stupid push mower, right, that mowed the lawn with that, right? See, Bill's raising his hand back there, right? Right? We didn't pay for dry cleaning. We didn't pay to have someone do our taxes. We buy a lot of things, and of course, daycare being a huge piece of this too, right? As people get wealthier, they use their money to substitute for labor in the household. So all of these things together made it possible for women to work and to work in increasing numbers. Here's the important part of this, though. This predates the 1960s. There's a story, and particularly a story conservatives like to tell. That goes something like this. 20th century, women didn't work. Along came the 1960s. Boom, women worked, family goes to hell in a handbasket, right? That's just not true. All right? And it's not true because women were working all along. We know from Mad Men, women were working, right? So that story is not true, right? The better story is that over time, women were working more and more, and that the feminist movement, if anything, was a result of women working more, not a cause. Think about those women in Mad Men and the way they were treated in the workplace. You can see why the feminist movement would be attractive to them or to their daughters later on, right? There was one thing, however, that happened in the 1960s that was a huge explanatory factor in both more to some degree in women working, but in the kinds of jobs they took and the way that impacted families, and that is the pill. For the first time in human history, women had complete control over their fertility. They did not need to rely on men for birth control. And this made it possible for women to engage in better family planning, to create work careers for themselves that were better timed in terms of having children and work and so forth. This was a huge change for women, and one that perhaps women in this room, younger women in this room, take for granted, right? But the ability to have not just a job, but a career, right? The pill played a huge role there. And again, the wealth and technology that economic growth brought with it made this possible, all right? So if we want to kind of sum this up a little bit, right? If we think about family in the 20th century, capitalism's wealth led to 2 key trends. Women's financial independence, right? As women became wealthier, they had more leverage within marriage, they had more ability to strike out on their own, and importantly, this was part of the reason we see the decline of the benefits of specialization by gender. Now, what does that mean, right? I know there's a lot of econ students in the room, but think about it for a moment. For most of human history, right, you can think about marriage as a kind of exchange between 2 people who specialize. Men generally specialized in earning income in the market. Women generally specialized in household production. They get married, right? They specialize, they trade, there's comparative advantage. It's a very typical kind of economic story. But what begins to happen in the 20th century is that men and women's human capital begins to look more and more alike, right? Both men and women can earn livings in the marketplace. And the benefits that come from the specialization of marriage decline. Not surprisingly, right? Marriage in general offers fewer material benefits to people. The economic benefits of getting married are less when men and women look much the same. And you can see, right, how that's going to lead to fewer marriages. And it has, right? We see fewer marriages, we see people getting married later. But interestingly, as the economic benefits from marriage declined and as the economic role of the family declined, marriage and family took on a larger emotional, psychological role. When the economics cleared out, love moved in, okay? And now marriage and family are mostly about love and affection and those sorts of things. And we think that that's a good thing, right? We like that about marriage, that it's about those things. And what made that possible, again, was the nature of work, the wealth, all the things that capitalism brought in its wake. Of course, one of the consequences of this, as I mentioned earlier, is rising divorce rates. And there's no doubt, right, that these same forces have produced the increase in divorce rates. And you can think about it, again, as economists like to, as being a combination of changes in preferences and constraints. Think about this. Constraints is the easier one to think about. As women gained more financial independence, right, women were more easily able to leave marriages in which they were unhappy or in which there was abuse or whatever else was happening that made them want to get out. Having that financial independence made it easier, lowered the cost of getting divorced. But there's a preference story here too. Think about this for a minute, right? The way in which marriage became about love raised our expectations for what marriage is supposed to be about, right? Marriage is now this marvelous, gauzy, romantic, beautiful thing. If your marriage doesn't live up to that, something's wrong with it, right? And you might think about getting out, right? Before marriage was about love, people didn't worry about that kind of stuff. How many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? If you remember Fiddler on the Roof, right? When Tevye and Golda sing to each other, right? About do you love her, right? It's like love. No, it's not about love, right? I learned to love him, but we lived together. We made a family together. It's not about love. And if you've seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, by the way, same story, right? That's another great story about the different notions of marriage, right? The parents, Tula's parents, right, wanted to marry a Greek guy, and they have this very traditional notion of marriage. And she says to her mom, if you've seen the movie, you remember the scene where she says to her mom, to Leni Kazan, she says, oh, but Ma, I love Ian Miller. I love him so much, Mom. I love him so much. And what does the mom say? She says, oh, Tula, eat something, right? Like you're being silly, right? That's silly, okay? And so this whole notion that marriage is about love has upped our expectations and makes it more likely that people will be unhappy with their marriages. Interesting point about that, by the way, is that to the extent that that's been brought by these larger forces of capitalism, it's ironic that conservatives, right, who insist in many ways that marriages should be about love, right? It's marriage being about love that's also partially responsible for there being more divorce than there used to be, right? I also want to argue that this story about divorce was inevitable, and it's mostly irreversible. This is toothpaste that can't go back in the tube. The economic changes that have taken place will make it very, very difficult to go back to a world of very low divorce rates. That said, one interesting thing we're seeing happen right now is that divorce rates among cohorts have fallen slightly. The peak in divorce rates was about 1980. It's come down since then. And couples who have been married for, say, 5 years or 10 years today are less likely to divorce than couples who were married for 5 or 10 years 10 years ago. And what this suggests is what we're seeing today are fewer marriages, but better marriages. And that's an interesting thing to think about, too, and what the implications of that are. All right. What about the 21st century? So it's now 2017, right? We've now got, almost a fifth of the century gone. Eeks, right? So what's been the big issue, of course, right? The big issue this century has been the demand for legalized same-sex marriage. So what does this have to do with this story? Well, I want to suggest that capitalism and its wealth had a significant role to play here too. And this is a point, by the way, that's been noticed and emphasized by thinkers on the political left in some interesting work. Okay, so what did we get out of capitalism and its wealth that has anything to do with same-sex marriage? Well, let's think about a few things. First of all, it was this wealth that capitalism produced that made it possible for people to survive outside the heterosexual family. For most of human history, you needed a spouse and you needed kids to be able to survive economically. But once we got wage labor, it was at least possible for people to survive single, right? To survive outside of the family. And this made it at least possible for people to have lives that weren't centered around heterosexual marriage. We saw the growth of cities, and the growth of cities made anonymity possible. And to the extent that homosexual behavior was stigmatized, living in a large anonymous city was what made it possible for people to not just be gay and lesbian, but to lead lives in which they were gay and lesbian, and to have relationships like that in ways that weren't possible before. People have always engaged in homosexual activity. What became different in the last 125 years is that people would identify themselves. They would see that part of their lives as being who they were as gay or lesbian. Even the word homosexual didn't exist in the way we understand it until the 1880s, okay? And so this is a product also of these changes that we're talking about. It's also true that capitalism and liberalism and democracy gave us a broader sense of anything that's peaceful, right? The idea that as long as people are not harming each other, they should be free to do what they want. And that certainly helped us be more sympathetic to gays and lesbians and the choices that they were making. Perhaps most importantly, though, among heterosexuals, there was a separation of sex and marriage and kids. For most of human history, how did it go? You were supposed to get married, then have sex, then have kids. But in the 20th century, that all changed. You could have sex and not be married. You could have sex and not have kids. You could be married and have kids, married and not have kids. You could be married and have sex, married and not have sex. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities here. The pill was a key part of this, as was other forms of birth control. But this whole separation of marriage, in particular, marriage and procreation, was crucial, and it generated among heterosexuals by these economic forces for making it possible for people to think about the idea of same-sex marriage. But perhaps most important was a point I just made a little while ago. The evolution of marriage from being about economics to being about love. When marriage became about love, the notion for many same-sex couples, the question became, well, then what's different about us? We love each other. Maybe we can't have kids and we don't want to adopt, but there's plenty of heterosexual couples like that, right? Why is our relationship any different from theirs in these ways? And I think that the demand for same-sex marriage was a result of the confluence of all of these forces. And as the historian of the family, Stephanie Kuntz, has pointed out, the real revolutionary change in the family was not the demand for same-sex marriage, but rather when marriage became about love. And when marriage became about love, this is what made it possible for us to reach the point where we've reached and where we ended up with Obergefell versus Hodges, right, to have this decision that is now a legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, or at least to overturn the bans on same-sex marriage nationwide. And certainly the United States is hardly the only country for which this has been the case. And again, in the Western world, we've seen this happen. And one of the reasons is that all of these forces have come together in these ways. But once again, right, as I said earlier, don't misunderstand me, right? This is not an argument that families are bad, right? In fact, it's an argument that families are good. And it's an argument that there's all kinds of different ways that people can form families. The question we face in the 21st century is that we need families, right? We need families to raise children, to transmit norms, to do all kinds of things that markets and politics can't do. The question is whether and how well various kinds of forms of the family are able to do that, right? Families have splintered into all these different kinds of ways people organize themselves as families. Can they all get the job done? One last thought I'll leave you with on this point is, when I say get the job done, I think one of the real problems today is that people think that the only successful families and the only successful parenting is parenting in families that get an A or an A+. Right? As if you don't do it perfectly, you suck, right? And I'm sure there's, students here who kind of all of a sudden went, oops, that sounds like my parents, right? Think of it this way. I think parenting is better understood not as having to get that A or the A+, but more like taking a class pass-fail, right? The question is, can you launch them? The adults in here understand this probably better than the children do, right? I have two kids. My son's 25, my daughter's 21. My son is successful, makes actually ridiculously good money. He never boomeranged. He never came back to the house. He's a functional, mature adult. My daughter, I think, even though she's a theater kid, I think she's going to make it, okay? To me, that's all that matters, right? I might not have been an A+ dad, all right? But my kids are like successful. They're supporting themselves mostly. They're doing okay. They're good people too. My daughter's hilarious. That's a different story. All right? it's pass-fail, right? And if we keep putting the pressure on parents to be A and A+ parents, and if you put the pressure on yourselves to do that as you get older, right, I think that causes more trouble than solves problems. And so I think the question we face is, what kinds of families can get the job done? What kinds of families can, especially when it comes to kids, produce passing kids? One last thing, and I'm doing it a little bit right now, which is we tend to get overly focused on kids when we talk about marriage and family too, right? But adults matter. And I'll just make one quick side point, and people can certainly ask about this in the Q&A. There's no doubt that children who come from families of divorced parents, on average, do slightly worse than kids from intact marriages. The social science is pretty clear about that. Two things to think about, though. That's an average. That doesn't mean every kid of divorce is a disaster, right? It just means on average, there's some small differences. But it also, the thing that we don't think about there often enough are the parents, right? They count too. And if parents are miserable together, right, what's the trade-off between the parents' utility and the kids' utility? And should the kids be the only ones who count? One of the things we know from the research is that the worst thing that can happen to kids is to be exposed to conflict. So if parents stay together because they say, oh, if we get divorced, it'll be worse for our kids, and then start fighting in front of the kids all the time, that's actually worse for them than getting divorced and having a good relationship after divorce. So when we think about these issues, we need to not just think about kids, we need to think about parents too. So my last slide, there's my good buddy, Freddie Hayek, famous economist. And Hayek once said, right, of what the liberal position, what I'm calling this classical liberal position, that economic change, economic freedom, and social freedom should go hand in hand. Hayek said that position is based on courage and confidence, on a preparedness to let change run its course, even if we cannot predict where it will lead. And I think that people today who worry about the family, right, with some historical perspective might get them to think about the ways in which families have always changed and evolved, right? And sometimes there have been backward steps, sometimes forward steps, but people have much more freedom today to form the kinds of families they want, right? Much more freedom, the kinds of freedom that we talked about for women in particular. And certainly childhood is a much better place, all right? Free markets and capitalism produce a social world and culture that we cannot and should not try to control. Liberals, people who think that markets and social freedom are good things, have a rational optimism that the results of these processes will be desirable. And one piece of evidence for that is the way in which capitalism changed the family from being a repressive and patriarchal institution into a much more loving and far more equal one. And I think when we think about the kinds of things that families do today and the kinds of ways in which families organize themselves and the freedoms that women and children in particular have, we should recognize the role that capitalism played in making that possible. Thank you all very much. And I'm happy to take questions. I think we have some mics up front.
Yeah, we have mics up front. You can ask from your seat if you want to, if you're not kind of a move up front kind of person. There's little switches on these. I can turn these on. Any questions from the audience? I can start one off.
It's tough on Friday night.
It is. It's tough. Waka waka. I can carry the mic to you. Why don't I do that? Because people don't like walking up front. You can tell by these empty chairs. People have a front thing going on. And if you're exiting, leave it. I
know that besides capitalism, there are also many other economic systems such as socialism or democratic socialism that also help the society to transit to modern family. So what do you think of that? And what do you think are the differences in each economic system that help this transition?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that those systems are sort of more recent, right, than capitalism. And in many ways, I think the democratic socialism question is the most interesting one, right? What are we seeing happen in other parts of the world today that have moved to those kind of systems? I think there's a couple things to think about. Many of the economies that call themselves, if you're thinking like the Scandinavian economies, for example, in fact, still have solidly market economies, right? What they have are just large welfare states, right? They have large social programs. And those are a mixed bag, right? Certainly one of the things, I didn't talk about this a lot in my presentation, but one of the things that's mattered for how families have evolved, certainly in the last 50 years, have been the ways in which social programs have changed the incentives facing people. So certainly we see, for example, more single folks because the way that taxes and welfare systems work often discriminate against marriage. One of the other things we see is fewer marriages among African Americans, often because incarceration rates, thanks to the war on drugs and the problems in the police and judicial system, have put so many African American men in jail. So those are, those kind of problems are real. And what we see in a lot of the democratic socialist countries, nominally so, is we see, for example, programs that are giving more parental leave and all this, and that has certainly changed the incentives facing parents about how many kids they want to have, about how they want to trade off work versus children. There's all kinds of interesting studies about whether those have really helped women and kids or not, and that's a bigger topic to go into, right? But underneath it all, you can't have those programs unless you've got these sort of longer run underlying economic forces that are producing this wealth. And so even in places like the Scandinavian countries, right, in many ways, in fact, by some measures, they're more capitalist than we are these days. What's made that possible is the kind of wealth and these longer run things that capitalism has done.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, we have a question over here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you answered my first question. I was thinking of the Scandinavian states when you mentioned, the things that you were saying. But I also want to understand, having studied the turn of the century, and I'm speaking of the 19th and the 20th centuries, and we saw the fight really between, federal regulation and no regulation, and we saw how these corporate Mongols were able to really, establish all this wealth, and you saw the suffering of the lower classes without any regulation. So I'm trying to understand sort of the balance between regulation protecting the weakest in society and sort of making it difficult to have a free market.
Right. So a couple things I'd say about that. That turn of the century was a really fascinating time for a bunch of reasons. And there were multiple elements going on in what we call the progressive era in the United States, right? There was a lot about children and family going on there too. And a lot of it was middle class and upper middle class white native born folks thinking they knew better how to raise immigrants' kids than the immigrants did. And so a lot of the legislation that was passed at that time that was designed, intended anyway, to supposedly protect people was a kind of, xenophobic elitism on the part of those groups that was not, was a same sort of fear of immigrants that we're seeing now, and the kind of not refusal to understand that different practices, were not necessarily bad. So the same sorts of folks who were engaging in the economic regulation were often engaging in this kind of regulation. I think the other thing to recognize when we think about the bigger question of the economic regulation of that era is that it was often big business itself that was writing those regulations because those regulations favored those businesses, right? For example, if you're thinking about things here like the Food and Drug Act and antitrust and all, and the railroads and all these other kinds of things, it wasn't the case that it was like Congress and the people saying, you guys are terrible, we're going to, put regulations on you. They recognized, often because they were being outcompeted by smaller firms, that if they got a hold of the regulatory apparatus and designed it in ways that they liked, it would actually help them. And I think when you read the history of that era carefully, what you see is a lot of that regulation was not because markets were so terrible and competition and free markets were so terrible for common people. It was because it was often terrible for the business people who had to compete in those markets, and they wanted to grab the state and sort of buy out members of Congress to get them to do their bidding for them. So there's a whole interesting literature, and a lot of that literature that makes that argument is from people on the political left sort of criticizing business people for doing that. But for people like me who think free markets are pretty good, it makes an important point too, which is nobody hates capitalism more than the capitalists, right? That's that they're not the real beneficiaries of free markets because they have to compete and they have to work hard, and they'd rather have monopolies. They'd rather have politicians doing their bidding for them. Think about the way cab companies have tried to block out Uber, right? What you saw in the early 20th century was just another version of that.
We have a question over here.
I'm not sure how related this question is, but how much would you say the effects of family and the parents have on the success of the child versus how much effort the child themselves puts into themselves?
So there's all kinds of interesting studies about how much parenting matters, and there's big debates about this. It does seem to be so I think the best way I can summarize it is as follows. There's bad things that parents can do that can really damage their kids, right? If you neglect your kids, if you lock them up in the closet, if you don't love them, right? If you don't give them those sorts of things, you can harm them. There's less that parents can do to sort of assure their success. There does seem to be pretty strong evidence that sort of kids are born, sort of behavioral genetics matter a great deal. That kids are born with dispositions and skills and abilities that while parents can harm them if they don't do the right things, there's not a lot they can do to enhance them, right? And again, there's big debates about this, right? And about what the size of these different factors and so on. So, for me, parenting matters a lot in the sense that it's like a doctor. First, do no harm, right? Love your kids, give them opportunities, but it's not like, playing baby Mozart for them when you're pregnant is not going to make them geniuses, right? And so, all the kinds of ways in which parents stress themselves out thinking that they're doing all these wonderful things for their kids probably don't matter all that much and probably do more harm because it makes the parents all stressed out, and that makes it harder for them to be good, loving parents. And so as a parent, right, my view with my kids was I'm going to create opportunities for you, but I'm not going to sort of force you into all these things and make you do all these things and sort of put all this pressure on you because it's going to make me crazy, right? And I got better things to do with my time and my sanity than to worry about things that I'm probably not having much influence with. Yes, sir.
Why did it take all the way until the 1960s and 70s for the civil rights movements to take place, and why did they all happen at once for the most part?
Why did they all have, what was the last thing?
Why did they all start to happen at once?
Oh, so yeah, you're thinking both in terms of sort of race and gender and orientation. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things going on there. I think that part of the story I told helps answer the gender question, right? That the economic forces were bringing women out into the public sphere, both in the market and politically, in ways that they hadn't been before. And having been out in the public sphere and realizing the way and seeing the way that they were being treated, right, that certainly generates it. And without that, I think in the past, there was no, and women also didn't have the resources to sort of, to fight those battles in ways. I think that's part of it. I also think so that's part of it. I think in all three of those cases, ideas changed, right? I mean, we just began to live in a society. One of the stories of American history is that we've slowly recognized the ways in which we didn't live up to our own values, right? And we can think of slavery as certainly being part about that, but we can think about racial relations in the 20th century and then gender and now sexuality as all being things where, hey, you know what? We have these stated values about equality, about the dignity of people, and we've violated those. And as we've sort of, each of those has broken down, I think we've put the pressure on ourselves to treat the remaining folks more fairly. Now I think we're seeing this I think the battle over immigration right now is a battle between that same battle being fought in those ways. But I do think that sometimes, it takes, for major political change to take place, things have to happen in public and visible ways, right? And I think if you think about, say, the sexuality question, gays and lesbians and certainly lesbians were not visible in ways that made this an issue until into the 1960s and 70s. And I even think the same-sex marriage issue, I've talked about the economic factors, but I think an equally important factor was before we talked about marriage, right? Certainly people, as homosexuality became more public and more people were out, everybody knew someone who was gay and lesbian. And many people had gay and lesbian relatives and friends who were couples, who had been longstanding couples, who loved each other, who looked just like the rest of us, right? And as those things became more visible, right, it was easier to hold our feet to the fire and say, hey, we're not treating them fairly, we're not treating them equally, we're not treating them by our own values. I just think sometimes it takes time that the underlying social forces and relationships have to change in ways that enable those things to be visible for us to say enough, right? And then we get the changes in the law that we've seen. The interesting, just as a prediction, right? Two things you might think about. I think there will be an interesting similar, it already is, right? Battle over the trans community, right? And about what it means to treat them fairly and equally. And then the other marriage battle, of course, will be plural marriage, right? Right? Whether, polygamy is I think, not quite the right word, but what's going to happen there down the road is an interesting question. My quick prediction would be something like the following. For same-sex marriage to be a feasible political alternative, enough Americans had to be convinced that it wasn't harmful. It wasn't harmful especially to kids, but wasn't harmful in other kinds of ways. And I think that's what's going to have to happen with plural marriage. The problem is that historically, societies that have practiced plural marriage, especially one man, multiple wives, have been disasters for women. And somehow convincing people that doing it in a sort of wealthier Western society wouldn't be damaging, that's going to be the really tough hill to climb. And nothing, you got to understand, the law follows culture here, right? The law is not going to change until the culture changes. It's interesting to think about the same-sex marriage thing, right? Another way to think about that is lots of smaller units of government and lots of private firms were extending the benefits of the sort of economic benefits of marriage and civil unions to same-sex couples long before the law changed, right? And I think that's what we have to see happen first, is that the culture has to change because the underlying economic forces can't be resisted, and because we have those values that we hold ourselves to. That's a great question, and obviously, you should take a course on the civil rights movement if you haven't, and get a much better answer than I just gave you. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here tonight. My question is, given the contrast between the federal government that the Constitution established and the federal government of today, and given how easy it is to commandeer the state for the purposes of those who do, what is our best hope for putting a brake on the economic coercion that comes from the state's intrusion?
Coming to lectures like this, not just because it's me. No, I think changing ideas, right? I think you can't, again, I think ideas matter tremendously. And the reason we got the bad stuff we got, whatever your definition of bad is, right, in the 20th century, is because people believed that it was necessary for government to play a bigger role, right? And I think that they were wrong about that, right? And if one thinks they're wrong about that, the only way to change that is that people have to believe differently. Again, the law, I think, follows ideas and culture. So you can't, you're not going to go in and suddenly interpret the Constitution in a different way, or to interpret the economic clauses in the Constitution in a different way. You're not going to get a different reading of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution unless people think, right, that and would accept that would have some validity, right? That has to be understood differently. And certainly some of the changes that we've just talked about here, right, in sort of understanding what words like equal mean in the Constitution, right, came because people's ideas changed. And I think if you want to think about it on the economic side, if you want to sort of go back isn't even the right word. If you want a world in which the constitutional constraints on economic regulatory power have bite to them and meaningful, people have to believe that's the right thing to do. And, ironically, it might be one of the weird unintended benefits of the Trump presidency, and there's got to be a benefit there somewhere, might be that people realize that when you create these institutions of power, right, even if you think they're going to be used for positive and beneficial things, when the wrong guy gets his hands on them, we start dropping the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan and everything else that's happening, right? So I think, that might be a cautionary tale about the dangers of expanding the power of government, that you can't just assume the people you like and will do the things you would like it to do will be the ones with the power. And that might be a change we see happen too.
All right, I get a point of privilege. I want to ask a question.
Oh, now I'm worried.
No. Actually, looking at your slides going back to childhood, I have a disabled daughter, cerebral palsy, developmental delay, and this is just anecdotal now, and that's why I'm asking you. But I think about it, and I wouldn't have wanted to have to face this 40 or 50 years ago. So, in your work about the differences of both how children are treated and how children grow up, did you touch it upon, or did you find anything about the differences as economic wealth increased under capitalism about how disabled children within the family are treated?
I honestly don't know the literature on that in any detail, but I can say a couple general things, right? There's absolutely no doubt that the wealth that we have created over the last 150 years has made it possible for us to not just keep alive, but to sustain and have meaningful lives for all kinds of physical and other disabilities for both children and adults. I mean, children died of all kinds of things for most of human history, and certainly the resources, I mean, not just the technology, but the sheer resources weren't there to sustain kids with disabilities. And my guess is, and again, it's depressing enough reading about what happened to reasonably healthy kids historically. My guess is that there just wasn't much in the way of resources devoted to them, because what could you do, right? And when you're living on the margins, right, you can't. I mean, even think about I'm really, really nearsighted. Think about what it must have been like to be really, really nearsighted before the invention of glasses, right? Or to think about, Down's syndrome, to think about all the kinds of things that kids have, or adult, an adult gets a limb chopped off or something like that, right? One of the interesting things to think about in the economy we live in today is how much work in that economy is sort of mental work that people who have physical limitations can much more easily do than they used to. It's much more, if you have physical disabilities or limitations, it's much more easy for you to be a productive member of society today and contribute to the economy and be independent in all those kinds of ways because of the nature of that change that we've seen happen. Whereas if all that was open to you was agriculture or crafts, right, what were you going to do? And I think that's an underappreciated point about modern wealth and capitalism's role in producing it, is it's given us not just the resources to support the lives of people who probably wouldn't have made it years ago, but to give them, to have work that they can take that's work of dignity, that's work of independence, that gives them the opportunity to create meaningful lives in ways that wouldn't be before. Again, it depends on how severe the disability is, of course, but certainly the resources that we think of, severely disabled kids, for example, who need hospitalization and 24-hour care, the fact that we can devote resources to that is indicative of the fact that we can largely, at least again in the West, feed ourselves and clothe ourselves, that we can afford the labor to put you guys in school, to take care of children with disabilities. So I think that's a general answer to that question. We actually have one down front here too, Bill. That was something we haven't heard from you. Okay. Yeah.
I did see the other one.
Okay.
So you mentioned more about the past and how capitalism has done. Area of the growth in the development of capital.
Yep.
But when it comes to the problem, and in a more recent, what do you think that free trade capitalism has caused more competition on schools that led to more stressful life, where people are the less engaged with families? So, looking at that, can't you say that there has been a peak that you've already passed and now it goes doing capitalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So have we entered this sort of world of sort of extreme competition among firms, and that has put more pressure on workers to work more and spend less time with their families and so on? I think there's some truth to that, right? I think that there's some evidence that particularly salaried workers tend to work more hours than they used to. The question is, again, well, let me put it this way. What we should care about is whether that has damaged families. If people are able to work more and still raise their kids successfully and have loving relationships and so on, right, great. It's not clear to me that those stresses, which I think tend to affect a slice, though not a small slice of the workforce, right, are responsible for problems within families. I have to think about that. I do think you're right that I think what's happened is people face more pressure. How do I put this? They're being pulled harder in two different directions, right? They're being pulled harder to do more things at work. How successful they can be to resist that and so on is the interesting question. But I can't think of, there's lots of anecdotal stories about how that might impact families and kids, but the evidence that I know of in the social science literature is at the very least mixed. So that said, let me point to a counter trend, right? One of the things we've also seen happen, certainly in the last decade, is more and more people able to work from home, right? The computer technology and the internet and so on. We used to call it telecommuting. No one calls it that anymore. But people can work from home in ways. My brother is a software engineer, and he works from home 3 or 4 days a week, right? Goes in the office 1 or 2. And his kids are old. His kid is older. But I think, people who have small kids, the idea that you can work out of your house, right, changes a lot of the things we've talked about here. Now, right, you can work and can take care of the kids, you can do your work, you can be there when the kids get home from school, right, in ways that actually give you more time with your family than you used to. Again, is that available to every worker? Of course not, but there's some workers being pulled by the corporate competition this way. There's other workers who now have this ability to have this flexibility that they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so Japan has notoriously bad like relations between the sexes, women have fewer rights than the rest of the developed world. What would you explain that, and why is that not? Why, for how developed they are, why are they still not?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll say two things. One of this talk is based on my book, and in my book, I really did focus on sort of the Western family. So I don't have much in the way of expertise in the story I'm telling. I don't necessarily think whether it applies there is a more complicated question. But I do think that goes to it's ironically related to your last question, right? Which is, I think culture matters, okay? And you can have things deep in a culture that are harder to resist and dislodge. There's no doubt that Japanese women have more rights and more economic independence than they had 50 or 100 years ago, right? I think you're probably right from what I know, and I want to be careful, right? Less so than in the West. I think that's in say U.S. or Western Europe. I think that's right. It may just be that the process there is a slower one because there's different cultural factors there that aren't at play in the West, and that sort of that ability for us to hold ourselves to certain values that we've long professed perhaps isn't there in the same way. So culture and ideas matter a lot. And, there's one of the ironies of this talk, right, is I talk a lot about the economic forces that are driving this process. And you might, if you might think, wow, he sounds like a Marxist at times, right? And I think there's some truth to that, right? But truth to the fact that I do sound like a Marxist. But I think, unlike that story, I do think culture matters and ideas matter a lot too.